Thank you. I actually wanted to start by explaining the origins of this project because I'm a historian, and my previous work has been on late imperial Russia and more recently on Stalinism. So that does not look like a very natural topic for me. But it is, in fact, a paper which grows from a historical project on the origins of urban protest spaces in Kyiv and consequently anti-protest spaces as well. In short, I'm actually tracing the history of how Kyiv's central square became the Maidan, and there's actually a very interesting history there. But also in connection with that, it turned out that there is a certain logic to the symbolism, positioning, spatial characteristics of the anti-Maidan as well. In short, when you look at the revolution of 1905 in Kyiv, it becomes immediately obvious that the revolutionaries were looking for a location that would become a central protest space in the city. And the location was, in fact, the main campus, back then the only campus of Kyiv University, the so-called Red Building. The Anti-Maidan was also present in 1905. It actually centered around the railway repair workshops close to the railway station, which was in the same space where it is now, which means, of course, that they were in walking distance and relatively easy to go from the Anti-Maidan to the Maidan back then to beat up the protesters. Now, to beat up the protesters was, of course, ideologically justified in 1905 by the fact that they were revolutionaries and Jews and agents of the West. So as you see, some elements of this are still present, some are not necessarily so much emphasized. And of course, the government did not want to get involved. The government wanted to be above this fray, to portray itself as the protector of the order. Therefore, Kyiv's lower middle class and working class population was being mobilized, very often by factory owners actually, there is some continuity here as well, to participate in the counter-revolutionary movement, to go and beat up the revolutionaries and the Jews. The events of October 1905 led to two attempts to storm the campus of Kyiv University and to marches around the town by both the revolutionaries and the counter-revolutionaries. And at some point they settled on a new place of protest. And that place was actually the plaza where the seat of city administration was located, the city Duma or municipal council, which stood in the exact place of Maidan, Independence Square today. And this is how Maidan became a political platform in 1905. It actually kept the place in 1917 to 1920. It kept this place in the 1920s under the Soviet power when striking workers, in fact, show up in front of the Duma building because it now houses the Executive Committee of Kyiv Soviet and the Oblast Party authorities. There is actually in the city a long tradition of protesting in this place, which then is interrupted during the war because the Duma building is destroyed. And then, of course, the tradition of understanding this place as a place of protest comes back with a student strike on the steps of the Lenin Monument in 1990. Then it is restored by the Orange Revolution, and then it is restored, of course, in the most recent events. But what's interesting is that the positioning of the anti-Maidan turns out it is dependent on two factors spatially. First, it is in a certain relationship with the Maidan itself. So it tends to be nearby because it is actually contesting the central urban space. In order to portray this as a struggle between the two forces for the most visible space of protest, with the government ostensibly not being involved, the government being above this battle, and the police is then observing, for the time being, the conflicts between the Maidan and the anti-Maidan. This is the first relationship, and it is pretty much traceable until the conflict becomes violent, and then the police marches in, the riot police marches in on the side of the anti-Maidan. There is, however, another relationship, a spatial one, a very interesting one too, for this new trend in history, spatial turn in history, and that is the relations to the seat of power. I have to say that the Maidan itself also defined its positioning in Kyiv and, in fact, in other cities in both symbolic way and the way of relating to the seats of power. In Kyiv, as it happened, there was little symbolism after the monument of Lenin had been removed in 1990. So prior to that, you could protest on the steps by the monument, demanding its removal in part. After that, the main square is devoid of symbolism. It is actually empty in a curious way. That's an interesting Kievan situation, which I know from my previous work, because Kyiv, for so long, like after the war, Kyiv didn't have a monument to Stalin, for instance, which creates major issues for a variety of reasons and such. And then another kind of symbolism comes into play, and that is the location of municipal authorities which do support Anti-Maidan, which do support to a degree democratic students in 1990. And in relation to the Maidan, then the Anti-Maidan positions itself close by. But also the Anti-Maidan is mobile. The Anti-Maidan is mobile, unlike the Maidan, because the Maidan barricades itself in order to protect this public space that they are claiming to protect it. And also they realize that if they go on a march, which in fact historically they try to, especially during the Granite Revolution of 1990, in which so many participants of the Orange Revolution and the Maidan participated as young students, they try to organize marches to certain places in the city, especially in the 1990s, still being under the illusion that worker strikes could perhaps join the students and Bolshevik-type classic Marxist revolution would happen. So they do try to march, but then they realize that this is not working. They're coming back to the location. Now, the Anti-Maidan, in contrast, is mobile because they are not afraid that the police would take over the premises. In fact, they implicitly and sometimes very explicitly collaborating and coordinating their efforts with the police. However, it tends to be devoid of symbolism in a very interesting way in Kyiv. In the same way the Maidan is. They are not actually protecting the Lenin monuments. There isn't much to protect. Rather, they are focusing on defending the government buildings. And this is the reason why the Anti-Maidan ends up camping in Mariinsky Park in the center of Kyiv, next to the parliament. There is a long history to this park and the political action in this park. I'm actually given a paper in Germany next week specifically about it. But in short, it doesn't matter to the Anti-Maidan protesters. They have no idea about the political signification and cultural roles and such. And they wouldn't remember the prayers for the Tsarist family held in 1914 in the park, for instance. There is no continuity there in the way there is a continuity on the Maidan with the revolutionaries. The counter-revolution does not have a continuity in that. It has continuity in anti-Semitism, for instance. So the pogrom of 1905 is caused by very much the same anti-Western, anti-revolutionary sentiment as the anti-Semitic posters today on the Anti-Maidan. So that's why they end up in the Mariinsky Park, because it's next to the parliament and strategically allows them to, in fact, control the space to prevent the Maidan crowd from storming the parliament and also to protect the government buildings next door. But as I say, they don't stay, actually. They are mobile. But in other cities, however, there is symbolism, in part because they are not necessarily protecting the seats of power, and the seats of power may not be that crucial, and there is no sense of a contestation on a national scene, and the television picture is not necessarily present. But in other cities, you do get, for instance, a connection between the square on which the Anti-Maidan positions itself and the square on which the Maidan is, in symbolic terms, defined as a place where the Shevchenko monument is, as opposed to the square in which the Lenin monument stands in Kharkiv. Or in Odessa, the October Revolution Square, which over time featured several revolutionary and Lenin monuments and has a certain signification attached to it, certain historical connotations in this way. And it's telling, too, that the Shevchenko monument would serve as a gathering point for Maidan in Kharkiv, and that the monument to the Duke of Richelieu in Odessa, which of course is not a symbol of the West, as one would think, but the symbol of the city itself and the city history. So there are various symbolic connections they are trying to build to monuments and other places with significant connotations, but that does not seem to be the case in Kyiv. I'm going to end here.